Hey AP Hero. So this is a lecture that I wanted to make and publish to YouTube to try to get everyone caught up with what's happening in Russia. Specifically, this is supposed to follow up after some sort of in-class activity of learning about Marxism, socialism, communism, and all that. So if you're not understanding any of this, it's likely because you're going to want to go back and understand what is communism, who is this Marx guy. So there is a note sheet that goes with this. You can find it in Schoology, and I think I'm going to print out a few paper copies for people to pick up on Wednesday. So here we go. Kind of the title of this is Russia Trying to Catch Up to Western Europe, right? So this is sort of how we're going to try to understand this. See Russia as sort of this country that's behind, trying to catch up to modern Europe. And we want to look at to what extent did they fall short of what it means to be modern. So as a reminder of all the things that we're going to kind of cover in here and like the big key points to keep in mind through all of this, and again, this is not all going to make sense right off the bat, but after you're done with this, I hope you can kind of see all these big ideas. It's not that Russia is not modern because they lack analytical thinking, right? What we'll understand by the end of this lecture is that Russia did have some sort of enlightenment. There was rationality. Russian high society is similar to other European high societies. But it's that Russia lacks any kind of government like the rest of Europe, right? They fail at creating a successful constitutional government. The October Manifesto of 1905 leads to confusion, and it leads to a lot of political parties that really advantage radical ideas, right? Turns out that this October Manifesto is really not going to give a whole lot of real political power. So being moderate, right, being compromising is pointless because it's not going to lead to any actual reform. Instead, it's better to be more radical, to be more anarchist, and to lead mass rebellion. And that's why Lenin's Bolsheviks are bolded in italics and will be the most important party in the Russian Revolution. So let's get into it, shall we? So the first thing I'd like to start with is to remind you that in the 1800s, late 1800s, Russian art and culture is absolutely at its peak, right? This is sort of like the golden age of Russian art and culture, right? Like Tolstoy, Tchaikovsky, right? Great novelists, great composers, right? And so it's not that Russian modernity seems to fail because the art and the cultural movements or the intellectual movements aren't there. It's because everything else isn't there, right? Russia lacks the practical elements, the consumer element, right? The capitalist element of modernity. The element that Britain is really good at. So like think industrialization, right? Russia is still an extremely agrarian society and rural society when the rest of Europe is increasingly urban and industrialized. Russia also lacks a coherent sense of nationalism, right? And that's not for lack of trying. We do know that the Russian Tsars tried really hard to Russify the people in Ukraine, the people in Belarus, which is White Russia, the people in Poland, Moldova, Estonia, all of these locations. There's an actual attempt at Russifying them, getting them to speak Russian and know Russian culture, but we also know it doesn't really work. So there's this kind of question of why does the Russian government then proceed to reform its government in 1905, right? And we would like to think that it's probably something similar to what we've looked at in the past. It's probably some sort of national revolt. It's probably some sort of internal crisis. Not really. What makes 1905 so weird is that it's one of the first times we actually see a European government responding to an external threat from outside of Europe. So let's take a look at what happens here. Russia, first of all, has to have a lot of tariffs in place to protect a lot of its industries, right? Russian trade is quite limited, right? Connections with the rest of Europe are quite limited because they're trying to grow industries in their own country. And they're trying to attract foreign investment, right? And the idea is they want to move Russia to kind of this new economy that the rest of Europe is on. And all of this shows really impressive results, but it costs a huge toll on the peasants. And so there's already a lot of frustration building inside Russia. And then when you combine that with what happens in the Russian-Japanese War, which is sort of our external factor here, we get this really humiliating scenario for Russia. So, like, what the heck is... Sorry, let me see if I can't pause this video really quick. I don't know if you guys can see the bottom of that. This is 1905 Revolution and Bloody Sunday. What is exactly this Russo-Japanese War, right? Well, the Russo-Japanese War is a little complicated. Basically, Russia and Japan at this point are sharing a border. In 1895, Japan goes to war with China and wins. And it takes Korea, which was sort of a vassal state of China. It's a complicated way of saying that, like, Korea had a modicum of independence, and then China basically ensured that. And after 1895, Japan basically conquers all of Korea. And at this point, Russia actually owns a lot of Manchuria. So there's this sort of question of who's sort of the main power north of China. And the Russo-Japanese War is basically this kind of border conflict to see, like, who really is the more influential country in this region of the world. And obviously, when the war broke out, everyone in Europe expected the Russians to win. But that's not what happens. Basically, the Japanese start the war, and for them, this war is really close to their homeland. Their supply lines are great. The morale is high. This, to them, is a very important war, and they take it extremely seriously because they know how big of a power Russia is. Russia, however, really underestimates Japan, right? They see them as, Eastern, right? They see them as not possibly modern like Russia supposedly is. And Russia has two navies, right? They have one in the Pacific and they have one in the Atlantic. And their Pacific Navy is the more outdated navy, and so it's quickly defeated by the Japanese. And so Russia finds itself sailing its navy all the way around the world to Japan in the spring of 1905. And by the time they get there, they're intercepted by a very prepared Japanese navy in the Straits of Tsushima between Korea and Japan, where they decisively defeat the Russian navy, basically ending all hopes of resupplying and restoring order to their armies in Manchuria. And the Japanese are forced to sue for peace. Actually, the peace treaty was moderated by Teddy Roosevelt, the president of America at the time, and he ended up winning the Nobel Peace Prize for mediating the peace agreement. So this war, right, produces so much frustration with the Russian government. It proves to the Russian people that their government is inept and not nearly as modern as, a lot of Russian high society and government officials try to make Russia out to be. This is because Russia is facing this unique dilemma of attaining a complex Western society in a very actually illiberal, underdeveloped society, right? And these are the words of Gerald Fisher. So in response to this crazy revolution, that's breaking out in the countryside over frustration with the Russian government, they're forced to issue the October Manifesto. To give you an idea of just simply how angry people were with the Russian government, I want to play a quick video. This is a movie that came out in the 1920s, so it actually came out while the Soviet Union was around. And it has a lot of Soviet propaganda built into it. It's very anti-Tsarist Russia. But it's basically about this idea of, at one point during the Russian-Japanese War, one Russian battleship actually defected in the port city of Odessa, and they tried to create their own commune, the soldiers did, in the port of Odessa. And then Cossacks were sent in to go kind of take out these soldiers, and innocent civilians are caught in the mix. So turn this down a little bit. For a while, the idea is they lived together in this kind of beautiful commune for like a couple weeks, protected by this battleship, Potemkin, right? Filled with defecting soldiers from the Russian Navy. And I mean, the whole idea of the soldiers defecting from the Navy is just kind of showing as well, just how little faith people had in their government. But the main scene that makes this perhaps one of the most important movies of all time is this scene when the Cossacks come in. Sorry, I'm getting there. Yeah, here we go. And suddenly the Cossacks come in, right? And they come in at the orders of the Russian Tsar to put an end to this defection from the troops and the people sort of siding with them. Cossacks. The people are running down the famous Odessa steps. Still kind of a massive landmark in Odessa today. And you're wondering why some people are falling. It's a 1920 Soviet Union movie, so they don't really show the gunshots per se. But the idea is the soldiers open fire upon the crowd of people that are siding with the defecting soldiers because they see them as traitors to the Russian government. A woman sees her son shot and trampled. And she runs to go save him, but it's too late. And it's total mayhem on this fence. Now this is actually a real event. This really did happen. Lots of people died. And I know this part is a little dramatized, but the idea is some of the Russian peasantry goes to try to convince the Cossacks that they're good people, right? They're innocents. They're not siding with the defecting soldiers. They're not traitors to the government. And the woman angrily brings up her son to kind of make the same argument. Comes up to present to the soldiers, you know, the evidence that they shot a child, right, which is just unthinkable, right, because the child did nothing wrong. This is the most famous scene the entire movie. A Russian mother with a baby. She can't go down the steps with her carriage. She can't stay and be killed by the oncoming soldiers. So she doesn't know what to do, and she's shot. The film telling us she's been shot. Look at that fake blood. This is actually one of the most famous scenes in all of film history. This is the reason why Battleship Potemkin is often listed as one of the most famous movies of all time and one of the most important silent movies. There's this scene of the baby carriage going down the stairs. And remember, there's no stunt doubles, there's no computer renditions here. And there it is, right? Everyone dies, right? So the point that the movie is clearly trying to convey, right, is this idea that the Russian people do not trust their government, right? They find that the Tsar is basically evil. And so as a way of fixing this, the Tsar issues the October Manifesto of 1905, right? This is supposed to establish a two-house legislature called the Duma that gives like a kind of vote for the people. It also establishes free speech, freedom of religion, assembly, and of organization. And it adds additional concessions in November to continued unrest by the peasants. Trotsky calls this a constitution, but the core of the injustice, remains, right? He still says it's an autocracy. The reason for this is that the Tsar is still around, and the Duma cannot pass laws without the Tsar's approval. So at the end of the day, the Tsar still holds all of the power. So historians basically say that the Duma was not a truly representative assembly. Hugh Seton Watson says it did not become a truly representative assembly because the government had not wanted such an assembly. By 1914, political parties had been legally established, and while rebellion was punished, by 1914 in Russia, there's been now 9 years of tolerated political discussion. And all of this tolerated political discussion, for the very first time really in all of Russian history, gets people thinking about politics. But gives them all the anger and frustration of knowing that their politics cannot make any real change. So this meant that people found mostly the most revolutionary political parties the most inviting, right? You wouldn't want to be part of a conservative or centrist political party because you wouldn't need to be. You would just trust that the king would fulfill your political opinions. So political affiliation was really only associated with the parties that sought to overthrow the current order, right? Because if you wanted to participate in the current order, you didn't need to go vote because that was going to happen anyways. So the Social Revolutionary Party, the Cadets, and the Social Democrats all are sort of the huge parties. Social Revolutionary Party had actually been around for a few years, had been sort of illegal for a while, and it was basically a more right-wing kind of communist or socialist party, as weird as that sounds. They really looked to sort of reestablish like old values, right? Like the clergy, the church, communal living values, right? The Cadets were a little bit more Western, right? They wanted a constitutional monarchy. They basically wanted to model the system of Prussia. And then you have the Social Democrats, right? These are modeled after the German Social Democratic Party, and they're actual, real Karl Marx socialists. They believe in revolution, right? But similar to how Germany's SPD moved away from the revolutionary principles of Marx, the Social Democrats have two groups, right? You have Mensheviks, right, who believe mass political participation will be enough to overthrow the monarchy, and we need a movement of the people, of the masses, and of democracy. Well, you have Bolsheviks who want elite revolutionary workers to guide them, elite revolutionary leaders to guide them, like Lenin. So the alternative to sort of becoming a Western modern society is to adopt this elitist, Leninist brand of communism. And this is because the conditions in Russia are decidedly not like the rest of Western modern Europe. So at first, Russia's trying to catch up to the West. But as we'll eventually learn by 1917, Russia will be in opposition to the rest of the West. So that's all. Let me know if you have any questions or you're still kind of confused on why this October Revolution in 1905 matters and how it kind of sets up for future conflict in Russia. And good luck with your comp check on Thursday. Thanks, everybody.